From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors and those who love them. So, today, I got a question for you. What makes a man a Renaissance man? Now, people have used this term, Renaissance man, to describe a person sometimes now referred to as a polymath, right? Someone who excels in several fields of knowledge or expertise. The term Renaissance man conjures up thoughts of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Galileo, individuals who painted, sculpted, designed architecture, wrote poetry, made scientific advancements, invented ingenious devices, engaged in affairs of church and state, and risked their lives and liberty in the pursuit of knowledge, and eventually achieved immortality through their work. They both inspire and put to shame countless generations who wish to follow in their mighty footsteps. Well, interestingly enough, the person generally thought to be the prototype, or at least the earliest incarnation of the Renaissance man, is someone whose name isn't as familiar as it might be to many artists. But Leon Battista Alberti left an indelible mark on the arts, architecture, and letters, and provides us today with a vivid window to the past through his work. In terms of a polymath, Alberti had active interests in fields of study as far-flung as painting and sculpture, land surveying, art theory, cryptography, grammar, mathematics, optics, finance, household management, the education of children, the taming of horses, astrology, law, philosophy, and cartography, to name a few things, and, oh yeah, in his spare time, he was also a priest. No one had more eclectic interests than Alberti, and perhaps because of this, he remained a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. Well, he was a master of a few, at least. However, Leon Battista Alberti contributed at least as much to the development of the culture of the Italian Renaissance as any other old master or Medici patron. Alberti's particular quality of genius was in absorbing information and practice from various sources and comprehending the underlying theory behind that practice, and then he would put that into writing. He taught the Renaissance how to understand itself, and he gave the various arts and sciences perspective. And yes, that is a double entendre, in case you were wondering, for of course it is Leon Battista Alberti's writing that we find the art of optical perspective in painting and drawing set forth in a treatise, which was made widely available to the artists of Florence and eventually all of Europe, dramatically changing the landscape of the visual arts. And since he's getting his own podcast episode, you know that he had no small impact on sculpture as well. So Leon Battista Alberti, he was born to a prominent Florentine banking family, although at the time his family was living in exile from Florence, after the Alberti family found themselves on the losing side of a civic rebellion. So Leon Battista was born in exile in 1404 in Genoa. This makes him about a generation younger than artists like Donatello and Brunelleschi. So little Leon Battista, he showed his intelligence at a very early age and was sent to be schooled at a few of the best schools in all of Italy, including the University of Bologna. He became a doctor of law, both church law and civil law, while still in his teens. During his studies, he became very interested in mathematics and came into contact with prominent men in various fields of study, as well as high-ranking society and nobility. Now, Leon Battista's first written work of note comes from this time. It's a comic play written in Latin, which Alberti attempted successfully to pass off as a genuine antique Roman play. His forgery was just in jest, but it also served to reveal his literary skill. But at the age of 24, the exile imposed upon his family was lifted, and Leon was able to set foot in Florence for the very first time in 1428. Now, Florence, of course, at that time, in 1428, was in full swing in terms of the early Renaissance. You've got Ghiberti, he had just finished his first set of baptistry doors, and was several years into his masterpiece, the second set of doors for the baptistry, which Michelangelo later was to call the Gates of Paradise. Filippo Brunelleschi's enormous dome over the Florence Cathedral was half built. Must have been amazing to see. And Donatello was busy populating the niches of the cathedral's bell tower with figures of unprecedented originality and vitality. And just as impressive as the dome, Brunelleschi's experiments in optical perspective for use in painting, as well as Donatello and Ghiberti's use of such ideas in relief sculpture, had kicked off a small revolution in the visual arts that would soon transform the nature of European art. Alberti, through his family social connections, and also through his generally likable demeanor, he became friends with most of the prominent artists in Florence, most notably Brunelleschi, and it was this set of close associations that allowed Alberti to write his treatise on painting. It's written in Latin, and it's called De Pictura, which we translate as On Painting, and he wrote it in the 1430s. At Brunelleschi's request, Alberti also wrote an Italian translation, and Alberti dedicated this translation to Brunelleschi himself. And rightly so, I would think, because I'm sure that large portions of the explanation of the principles of one-point perspective most certainly came to Alberti directly through Brunelleschi. Although in the text of De Pictura, Alberti refers to himself as a painter, he was much more of a dilettante, or a devoted amateur. Alberti painted, a few paintings, fairly mediocre, generally landscapes. Giorgio Vasari, in his Life of Leon Battista Alberti, he writes, "In painting, Leon Battista did not do great or very beautiful works, for the few by his hand that are to be seen did not show much perfection, nor is this to be wondered at, seeing that he devoted himself more to his studies than to draftsmanship." So right around this time, Alberti also wrote De Statua, a treatise on sculpture. He wrote it in Latin and then translated it into Italian as Della Statua. At least that's one version of events. There's actually a lot of debate as to whether the painting text came first or the sculpture text, or even if the sculpture text was written first in Latin or Italian. In any event, the two texts, De Pictura and Della Statua, or De Statua, were published in the 1430s or 1440s at some point. And they were often republished, century after century, and usually printed together in the same volume, as the information of one complements the contents of the other. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the podcast. So in the 8 years between his first arrival in Florence and the publication of De Pictura and De Statua, Alberti often found himself in Rome. His far-flung circle of associations had brought him to the notice of a Catholic cardinal who was acting as emissary on behalf of the Pope. And so Alberti accompanied this cardinal on a few diplomatic missions, serving as a secretary. His work also got him appointed to the College of Pontifical Abbreviators, which was basically the diplomatic office for the Vatican, where he edited and copied official documents. It was also at this time that Alberti became an ordained priest. Further, it's also the period in which Alberti devoted himself to the study of the ruins of Rome, making meticulous measurements and surveys, much like Brunelleschi had done 30 years earlier. Alberti's participation in the papal court brought him back to Florence often through the 1330s and 1340s, and during this time he wrote treatises on several wide-ranging topics, like the one on how to break in a horse, and the one on how family life should be managed, and many, many others. His position at the papal court was solidified even further when an old university classmate of his was elected Pope Nicholas V. Talk about friends in high places, right? Well, most of his time was now spent in Rome, but being Alberti, he was far from idle. He continued to write treatises on everything he took interest in, as well as satirical dialogues and other literary compositions. But most importantly, it was at this time in which Alberti started to seriously address the question of architecture. The fruits of this interest in architecture turned into Alberti's substantial treatise, De Re Edificatoria, or in English, On the Art of Building. This work is made of 10 books and seems to have been complete by about 1450 or so, though it wasn't published until after his death. It was the first written work which dealt exclusively with the theory and practice of architecture since ancient Greece and the architect Vitruvius. Alberti's 10 books on architecture are unlike Vitruvius's writing, which recorded standard and historical practices in Greece. Vitruvius was kind of a custodian of traditions of Greek architecture. Alberti, instead, theorizes about a new architecture, based on classical sources, but also upon rules of proportion and other sources of inspiration to be found in nature. He wanted his ideas to yield a beauty in architecture that he thought would be, quote, so ancient and yet so new. As he does with his treatise on painting, Alberti presents to architects an aesthetic theory grounded in nature and proportion and harmony and order, things we today consider to be the cornerstone of Renaissance aesthetics. Alberti was able to actually put his theories for a new architecture into practice as well. Leading up to finishing his book in 1450, Alberti actually became involved in designing architecture, which was a bit of a departure for him, as most of his interests had mostly been academic up to this point. But apart from his writing, his architecture is his greatest contribution as a creator in the Renaissance. In Rome, he is involved with several different building plans connected with the old St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican. In Florence, we find his architecture and the theories behind it was very influential. He designed the Palazzo Rucellai, which was to influence civic architects for generations. He finished the facade of the Church of Santa Maria Novella in an innovative and much imitated design scheme. He redesigned the town center of the little town of Pienza for Pope Pius II, sort of an early example of Renaissance urban planning. And he designed churches and palazzi across northern Italy. But even in his success as an architect, he was really solely concerned with the design stage, and he really left the particulars of construction to builders, which was very unlike the role of architects at that time in general. Brunelleschi, for example, was much more hands-on, and he worked out himself the inevitable, unforeseen details and issues which arise with any building project. Alberti was merely concerned with the visual and spatial aspects of architecture. How his designs got built was not his concern, and it should be noted that only a fraction of his designs were finally realized. Now, apart from his varied and copious writing, the design of architecture was his main preoccupation for the last 20 or so years of his life, which ended in 1472. So that's who Alberti was, in a nutshell. Let's get into his work concerning sculpture a little bit and see what we can learn from Alberti's keen insight. Now, like most of his other areas of interest, he had little to do with sculpture as a practitioner. There seems to be only one sculpture that can be attributed absolutely to Alberti, and a few others that are probable candidates. The definite piece it's a small self-portrait in relief, maybe 10 inches high. It's a modest and, small work, as are the other two works attributed to Alberti. And while it's not bad, it's not particularly good either. It's sort of, It certainly doesn't give the idea that its author could have the capability to produce De Statua, which is the first treatise on sculpture technique. But, that was Alberti's gift, right? He could comprehend theory and systems which lay at the foundation of practice without needing to be a practitioner himself. And then he could explain in an understandable way these theories and systems, and he could even hypothesize improvements in practice based on those theories, advances which perhaps might not even have occurred to the actual practitioners of the craft. Now, at this point in discussing Alberti's De Statua, I need to make a full disclosure. I self-published an English translation of the Italian version of De Statua, which is known as Della Statua. I'm not doing this podcast on Alberti to sell my book, although, of course, you're welcome to buy it. But rather, I made the translation for the same reason I'm doing this podcast episode. Alberti's book on sculpture is little known and much neglected, not only by contemporary figurative sculptors, but also by art historians. It's really weird. I've never read a commentary on De Statua that seemed to have much understanding of or even interest in its contents. Just about the only available translation in English was published in 1970, and it's by Cecil Grayson, and it's long out of print. But his commentary on De Statua is really sparse, and it deals almost exclusively with questions and issues concerning the task of translating the work itself. Questions like, whether the Italian version or the Latin version is the most authoritative, or which words in the translation have no exact corresponding term in English, and all this sort of stuff. But what he neglects almost entirely to talk about is the actual content of the book. Now, apparently he did not have working sculptors in mind as his audience, but most likely he was writing for art historians, apt to pounce on any inaccuracy. However, Grayson's retention of the original formatting of the book, or rather the lack of formatting of the book, combined with the meticulously correct but incredibly stilted English translation, it makes his work basically unreadable and incomprehensible, and it's small wonder that it's out of print. So I made my own translation, mostly so that I could actually read and understand the text myself. The first thing I did was reformatted the text, because as originally printed and as reprinted by Grayson, it's a single book-length paragraph. Well, it's just a wall of text. And so I divided that text into sections so that I could more easily digest it. And when I translated it from Italian, I did so into modern vernacular English and concerned myself only with faithfully getting Alberti's meaning across rather than word-for-word exactitude. And when I had done all that, I finally understood just what I was reading. And since I'd come that far, I figured I'd add some helpful diagrams and images, write a short commentary, and put it online for people to have access to, so it's out there if you want it. Now, it may seem baffling that Alberti's treatise on sculpture seems to have suffered from such neglect for so long. But now that I've read De Statua, I can see a few reasons for this general neglect. First off, it's a very, very short book. My translation is all of 19 pages of large text. It seems to read like a fragment rather than a whole book. The book actually ends with what seems like a hasty apology from its author. It's just sort of a list of all the topics Alberti would have liked to discuss if he had the time, or if he didn't plan to talk about these subjects in other treatises. And so because of this, De Statua suffers in comparison with De Pictura, with which it is almost always published, when it's published at all. De Pictura, a more lengthy work, is divided into 3 books, and Alberti engages in long discussion about aesthetics and beauty, what makes a good painting, what the proper training and studio practice of a painter should be, as well as his groundbreaking exposition of perspective. Now, in De Statua, in contrast, most of the discussion is limited to technical processes and procedures, prefaced by a brief conjecture as to the origins of the art of sculpture and a few other sort of small topics. Aesthetic theory is entirely lacking. It's mere technique that Alberti seems to be concerned with. And I imagine from the point of view of an art historian rather than a practitioner of sculpture, it makes for pretty dry reading. Dry or not, is there something contemporary figurative sculptors can learn from a book written 600 years ago at the dawn of the Western figurative tradition? I think so. In addition to insight as to workshop practices from that time, Alberti offers insight into certain aspects of the fundamental processes of figurative sculpture. So here's a quick rundown of topics discussed by Alberti in his little book. The book begins with a short essay on what Alberti imagines as a possible origin story of sculpture, which is pretty banal. He talks about someone walking around and seeing a tree stump or a piece of dirt that kind of looks like a face, and then that person, his interest piqued, sort of hacks at the stump or, fiddles with the piece of clay until it looks a little bit more like a face, and then sculpture just sort of evolves from that. Then he talks about the difference between a sculptor's approach versus a painter's approach to his art, making 1 or 2 obvious points, but no real light bulb moments there. But then he talks about the source of inspiration and subject matter for sculptors. Now, if this text were a treatise written in the Gothic era, we might expect that the source and the subject matter to be God and the Church. But here we see a writer, perhaps for the very first time, clearly emphasize the preeminent role of the natural world as not only the inspiration and subject of art, which is new enough, but Alberti even goes farther. He claims that nature and the study of nature is also the source of sculptural technique. Here's a quote. "I resolve this, that in any art or discipline one extracts from nature certain principles, perfections, and rules, which if we examine them with care and diligence, and utilize them, we will undoubtedly do all we set out to do. And just as we have from nature in the form of a tree stump or a piece of clay or other material, as mentioned, forms which beg us to transform it into what we see in it, nature also shows us certain guides and certain means by which we may, with a solid step and sure principle, proceed as we wish. And when we become aware of this, and desire it to be put to use, we can very easily and with great convenience reach the highest degree of this art. So that's actually a pretty important statement in understanding Alberti's approach to much of his studies in art and architecture. The idea that natural laws, or to put it another way, scientific principles, are the fundamental basis for the creation of art. And when we realize this, Alberti says, and allow nature, both in her beauty and in her scientific principles, to guide our work, we will accomplish great things. This importance of this idea to Alberti shows itself in the very first sentence of his painting treatise, De Pictura. Again, I'll quote. This is the very first sentence of the whole book. To make clear my exposition in writing this brief commentary on painting, I will take first from the mathematicians those things with which my subject is concerned, and when they are understood, I will enlarge on the art of painting from its first principles in nature, insofar as I am able. So, according to Alberti, understanding the principles of art can only come after understanding the science behind it. And this science originates in the study of nature. Now, it's no wonder at all, really, he felt this way, because among other achievements in Florentine painting and sculpture, the new science of perspective provides a pretty convincing argument that scientific principle leads to the advancement of the arts. And it's not just in painting. The science of optics and perspective can be applied to the creation of sculpture in many ways as well. We'll get into that a bit later. Moving on with De Statua. Now, in discussing sculpture itself in De Statua, Alberti first makes a distinction between two fundamental types of figure sculpture, differences which he calls the two principles of likeness. So on the one hand, there is the principle of likeness in sculpture that provides a likeness in general, a likeness of a man or a horse or anything that can be recognized as its subject in a general way. On the other hand, there is the principle for those who, quote, want to represent not only the likeness of a man in general, but that of an individual. So this is an interesting distinction. He's basically saying that some sculptures are made to visually imitate a specific subject, like a portrait bust, or a statue of a known individual, like Socrates or Julius Caesar. And there are some statues that are not. The ones that are not are made to be recognizable, but not as a specific subject, just as a man in general, a person. And into this group we can fit allegorical statues and other idealized types as well as classical, canonical forms. Now, Alberti essentially divides sculpture into two groups, those of the real, of the individual, the real, and those in pursuit of the ideal, which to me is kind of an amazing feat, doing so as he did at the dawn of the Renaissance, because he basically begins a conversation which has been taken up and continued for 600 years by artists and academics. The history of sculpture, from Alberti's day onward, has been a tug of war between these two aesthetic principles, the real and the ideal. Each form has claimed dominance at different times in history, and both serve different purposes. And here's where Alberti makes an assertion which has implications for figurative sculptors working today. These two principles of likeness, Alberti claims, are achieved by two different working methods. He calls these two methods the method of dimensions and the method of pointing. And I'll get into what dimensions and pointing are in a minute. But first, Alberti's idea here is that there exist two general groups of working methods which yield two fundamentally different types of sculptures. I want to highlight this because I think it's something contemporary figurative sculptors don't talk about often enough, that different techniques produce different results. I mean, it's a fairly obvious statement, but even so, it's all too common to find figurative sculptors voice very partisan opinions when it comes to technique and training. Now, to some extent, this is natural. We want to believe, each of us, that we went to the best school and learned the best approach to the human figure, superior to other approaches. But there is no one technique or approach to the figure that is a one-size-fits-all method. Figurative sculpture is just too varied for that. For example, a very visually based technique, like sight-sizing sculpture modeling, might be the superior method for portraiture. But it is decidedly inferior as a method for producing figures caught in motion. Now, a modeling technique based on constructive anatomy, that might be the best method for figures in motion, but it also tends to produce a figure more stylistic than naturalistic. And this can be good or bad, depending on the desired effect. The point I'm trying to make is that the more we recognize the limitations and strengths of various techniques, the more open we will be to broadening our knowledge of several techniques, and the more versatile and masterful and deliberate our work becomes. So, the two basic bodies of technique that Alberti describes are as follows. First, there is the technique of dimensions, la misura in the Italian version of De Statua, or dimensio in the Latin. And it refers to taking measurements, lengths, widths, taking them right off the subject. So in this body of technique, we find the use of canons of proportions and measurement of widths using calipers or compasses or rulers or other point A to point B measuring devices. It is la misura, dimensions, that leads to the principle of likeness in general, according to Alberti. With a complete set of lengths and widths, a sculptor may work up a figure in clay which corresponds to a subject's general proportions. Whether that subject is an individual from which the measurements are taken, or maybe it's arrived from an average of many individuals, as in a canon of proportions. That's Alberti's principle of dimensions, working from lengths and widths. Now, the section of the book on dimensions is rather short, as dimensions involve no more than using a set of rulers to take lengths and a pair of calipers to take widths. As standard measurement devices were apparently scarce in the 1430s, though, Alberti describes how to actually make a set of rulers and how to make a set of calipers, which is kind of cool. But the best and most relevant piece of info in this section is that Alberti describes a method for enlarging and reducing measurements to increase or decrease the scale of a sculpture, which uses absolutely no math. It's kind of brilliant in its simplicity. And it involves using a full-scale ruler, right, made to the height of your living model. So your ruler is exactly as tall as your model. And then you make another ruler made to the same scale of your reduction or enlargement. So let's say you want to do a third life-size figure. You make one ruler the size of your model, and then you make another ruler 1/3 that size. And then on these rulers, you make an equal number of gradations. And the size of those gradations are according to the scale of each ruler. That means if the length of the model's arm measures 50 units on the full-scale ruler, then the proportional reduction of that arm in the clay model measures 50 units on the small-scale ruler, right? Does that make sense? So it's a pretty idiot-proof method of proportional scaling. And again, it involves no calculations or math of any sort, so it's kind of a good thing to know. And then we come to Alberti's second body of technique, which I translate as pointing. In Cecil Grayson's English translation, he has it as the setting of points, and in the Italian, it's por determini. And I translate it as pointing because what Alberti describes is identical to the process used by marble carvers when copying a plaster cast into marble, called pointing. And what pointing is the process of locating a specific point in space on the surface of a form, say the tip of a nose on a plaster cast, and locating a point identical to it on the surface of a copy of that form, say on a marble copy. Now, there are many tools and techniques in use today which allow a sculptor to point. You can use the compass technique, or the chassis technique, or the macchinetta a punto, known in English as a pointing machine. Three-dimensional scanning and robotic carving, new on the scene in recent years, also falls into this category of devices that point. And it is pointing, according to Alberti, which allows the sculptor to create a likeness of a specific subject, an individual, rather than a general likeness. Now, I've got several images of various pointing methods and devices on the image gallery of this episode, so cruise on over to thesculptorsfuneral.com, hit the episode gallery button, and check it out. But let me see if I can further clarify the nature and utility of pointing versus measuring. Now, they seem kind of similar, but in a nutshell, the function of Alberti's dimensions is the recording of lengths and widths, which is a two-dimensional measurement, right? Point A to point B, whether it's done with rulers or a pair of compasses, you're taking a two-dimensional measurement. With pointing, you are not recording a distance, but you are recording a position of one point in space relative to other points in that space. It's triangulation, and it works in 3 dimensions. It does not measure. It rather describes the relation of one point to another point. And here's a useful analogy to really understand the difference. Now, say you're in an unfamiliar city and you want to go find the town library. So you pull out your smartphone and you put in your destination into Google Maps or whatever, and your phone's GPS, with the use of several satellites, all taking measurements of distance from them to you, they use those measurements to then triangulate your position, right? And then it triangulates the position of the library, and then using the relation of one point to another point, it can then provide you with the means to go from your point to the library. But let's say you don't have a phone that has GPS. Let's say your phone comes equipped not with Alberti's pointing app, but with Alberti's Dimensions app instead, right? And Alberti's Dimensions app tells you that the library is 1 mile away. But that's all it tells you. It can't tell you in which direction to go. It knows the distance from you to the library, but knows nothing of your spatial relationship to the library. You can walk a mile, but you have no idea if you are walking in the right direction. And that's the difference between linear measurements and triangulation. Now hold on, you might say. Well, that's all well and good if I'm in the middle of a town and I'm looking for the library. If all I know that it's a mile away, I'm not going to find it. But when I'm modeling a figure in clay and I take a linear measurement of something, point A to point B, like a leg, for example, I'm not going to be putting that leg in sideways or above the head or something. I'm going to be putting it where it belongs, under the pelvis at one end, on the ground at the other end. And the measurement I took will ensure that I make it the proper length. The measurement gives me the distance, but I can use my eyes to figure out its relation to the rest of the figure. Well, if you think that, you would be absolutely right. However, if you think you're not triangulating when you do that, you're wrong. In fact, your eyes are judging the position and the relation of the leg relative to other points on your sculpture. And that's how you know not to put the leg in at the wrong angle or facing the wrong direction. Your eye, in coordination with your brain, of course, is an excellent tool for triangulation. Alberti's science of visual perspective for painters and for sculptors entirely depends on the eye's ability to triangulate. Fundamental theories of optics are built upon this. I'll get into that a little bit later, and so will Alberti, but first, let's explore this crazy little device invented by Alberti and described in De Statua for use by sculptors for pointing. And this device he called the definitore. Now, it's a simple enough device. I actually built one and have pictures of it at the episode gallery, so go ahead and take a look there, sculptorsfuneral.com. Or you can just imagine a disc. It's like the face of a clock, right? It has markings all around it, like minutes on a clock face, or maybe like markings of degrees on a compass. Now imagine this clock face with a single hand. But this hand is very long. In fact, this hand extends well beyond the edge of the disc. So if the disc is a foot, then the hand is something like 4 feet long, extending, a couple feet, several feet off the disc. And like a clock hand, the hand rotates around the disc, pinned in its center. Now, imagine this disc attached to the top of the head of a plaster cast of a sculpture, right? It's fixed in place, pinned right through the center of the disc, and the disc is sort of flat and parallel to the ground. But even though the disc itself is immobile, the arm can still freely rotate like a compass needle all the way around, 360 degrees. Are you with me so far? Now, imagine this long clock hand or compass needle. Maybe now we should more properly call it a boom arm. Now imagine this boom arm sticking out sort of over the top of the sculpture. And imagine that it's marked at regular intervals, like a ruler. And finally, imagine hanging from that boom arm, somewhere along its length, a string with a weight on the end of it, a plumb line. So you've got a disc, and you've got this boom arm hanging off the disc, and then you've got a plumb line hanging off the boom arm. This is the definitore. How in the world does it work? Well, Let's say that the sculpture on which the definitore sits is a standing figure with an open hand. And let's say you wanted to transfer the location of the tip of the middle finger of that hand. All you would do is simply rotate the boom, the arm, rotate it around the disc until the boom is directly over the hand. Then adjust the plumb line along the length of the boom until it is directly over the finger. And then finally adjust the length of the string of the plumb line until the point of the plumb bob is just touching the tip of the finger. And you now have 3 measurements that describe the location of that point. You've got the compass direction around the disc, you've got the length along the boom, and you got the distance from the boom to the plumb line. Now, if you had another identical definitore attached to a block of marble, you could dial up the same settings and measurements that are found on the first definitore. Then all you have to do then is just chip away all the marble right up to the point where the plumb line is now hanging freely, but just touching the surface of the marble. And where it touches is the corresponding point in the stone where the tip of the finger will be found. So if all that explanation made 0 sense to you, hopefully the image gallery will clear that up. Now, Alberti claims his wonderful device could be used to transfer points, not off of just clay models and plaster casts, but also off of living models. But I seriously doubt it was ever used that way. Models just don't stand still, as would be required. In fact, there's no evidence that Alberti's definitore was ever used in the Renaissance by his pals Donatello and Brunelleschi, or by anyone else. It's further evidence that Alberti's genius lay in theory rather than practice. It is a pretty impractical device, although, it's theoretically possible. And actually, that's not to say that it was never made or never used. In fact, I have found exactly one instance in which it was used, and it's a pretty spectacular instance. Gutzon Borglum, the 20th century American sculptor, built and successfully used several definitore in order to carve his masterpiece, the Mount Rushmore National Monument in South Dakota. The iconic, colossal sculpture of 4 American presidents has its technical roots in 15th century Italian Renaissance. You'll find pictures of Borglum's own definitore, or at least parts of it, at the image gallery, and you can do an internet image search as well for some historical photos of the definitore in use on Mount Rushmore. So after this section in De Statua, Alberti then discusses the use of canons of proportion, both comparative canons and anthropometric canons. A comparative canon is the kind based on rules of relation, such as a figure is 7 heads high, or a face is 5 eyes wide, or the distance from the heel to the knee is twice the length of the foot, right? It's all about one part of the body and its relation to another part of a body. And anthropometric canons are constructed from actual measurements, taken from living models or from sculptures, either individually or you can take an average of many individuals to come up with your anthropometric canon. Alberti also gives his own canon of proportions, which he says he devised by measuring several individuals that he selected for their beauty. So, kind of interesting. And then, suddenly, we come to the final section of De Statua, and it's very different from the rest of the book. It's only a few short paragraphs. Now, these last 8 sentences of the text, though, they're largely responsible for the book's historical reputation, a reputation of having a relative unimportance in relation to Alberti's treatise on painting. However, I have come to see this passage, this last 8 sentences, as crucial for more fully understanding Alberti's conception of the process of sculpture. And it's an understanding that may well have reflected the practice of his contemporaries like Donatello. Now, it's a pretty short passage, so I'm going to quote my translation of this passage in full, and then I'm going to sort of break it down and delve into its significance. So here's the quote. "I could tell you of many things. That which changes in a man when he is seated or standing, or leaning towards this or to that side. But I leave these things to the diligence and fastidiousness of those who are doing the work. Also beneficial is the knowledge of the number of bones and muscles and their projections. And besides this, it is greatly useful to know the rule by which we separate circumferences and divide bodies by the views of the parts that cannot be seen. For example, if someone cut in half an upright cylinder, so that the part which presents itself to the eye was divided and removed from that part out of view. Such a cylinder would be made into two bodies, in which the base of one would be in all respects similar to the base of another, and would have the same shape, being comprised of the same four lines and circles. This is similar to the observation of the sections of the bodies, so-called, seeing as how the contour of that line, which separates what you see of the figure from what you do not see, should operate in a similar fashion. And truly, this outline, were you to draw it on a wall, observing the wall in the same way, there would be represented a figure very similar to a shadow that was projected onto it from a light that shone from the same point in the air in which one had found the eye of the observer. But this method of drawing things by means of observation of contours and sections pertains more to the painter than the sculptor, and I will discuss it at another time. Further, those who wish to make this art their profession should know principally the distance of every projection or hollow of any member from a particular disposition of lines. The end. That's where it ends. Not exactly a satisfying conclusion. It just seems so abrupt, right? Alberti crams several subjects into these last lines, a laundry list of things that he would explain if he cared to, or if they weren't more useful and relevant to painters to know than sculptors, and he feels no need to repeat himself here. So it's Alberti himself who gives his own treatise the short end of the stick relative to his treatise on painting. But let's go back and look at this little laundry list he gives a little bit more closely, this list of many things Alberti feels is relevant for sculptors to know. He mentions knowing how proportions change according to the pose of the figure. He mentions the importance of knowing anatomy. That's all well and good. But then, Alberti attempts to explain something a little less familiar to our ears, and he uses a laborious analogy which only really muddies his explanation. Let's hear that little tiny bit of the quote again. "It is greatly useful to know the rule by which we separate circumferences and divide bodies by the views of the parts that cannot be seen. For example, as if someone cut in half an upright cylinder, so that the part which presents itself to the eye was divided and removed from that part out of view." Unquote. So it's a really awkward sort of way to attempt to describe the observation of contours. Alberti wants us to imagine looking at a cylinder, and where we perceive the exterior contour or horizon of that cylinder from a given point of view, that's the point at which the cylinder might be said to be divided or cut, right? Now, these few sentences are, in fact, the place where Alberti first makes mention of the role of observation and optics concerning sculpture. I mean, the entirety of De Statua up to this point had described only concepts of measurement and proportion for copying a model, ignoring the primary means by which sculptors create and judge and make comparisons with models to sculpture, the visual process. Now that we understand what Alberti means, we can lump this little tidbit of advice into his list, that sculptors, we know we should study anatomy, and we should understand proportion, and we should make a close study of the contours of the models. Fairly common sense stuff, right? Stuff we already knew to do, right? Again, there's more. Alberti goes to briefly touch upon how we should study those contours. And again, I'll quote it. "And truly, this outline, were you to draw it on a wall, observing the wall in the same way, there would be represented a figure very similar to a shadow that was projected onto it from a light that shone from the same point in the air in which one had found the eye of the observer." Very interesting. Let's delve into this. Alberti is saying that the observation of contour is like a light that casts a shadow on a wall. But he makes a point of alluding to the geometry of how we observe a contour. He talks about the eye as a specific point in space, which, like a light source, according to Alberti, casts rays to produce an accurate projection of a contour. Now, he is actually describing something similar to what goes on inside the eye, as light enters the eye and casts a projection on the retina. He doesn't understand that, naturally. His geometry is right, although, of course, the eye doesn't cast light, it receives light. But anyway, what is important is that right here, Alberti is on the cusp, right at the edge of discussing observational theory as regards sculpture. But instead of exploring it in De Statua, he merely goes on to say, "Oh, but this method of drawing things by means of observation of contours and sections pertains more to the painter than the sculptor, and I will discuss it at another time." How frustrating. Had Alberti bothered, we sculptors could have had an early manifesto of the use of visual observation for rendering a likeness in sculpture. Instead, he explores this topic in his treatise on painting, where he develops this idea into, among other things, a method for visual perspective. And because of this, centuries of art historians and sculptors themselves have misunderstood the relevance of visual perspective as lying in the realm of painters and not sculptors, unless a sculptor were working in a pictorial mode, such as relief. And with the exception of this very brief mention by Alberti at the very end of his sculpture text, there is no indication that De Pictura, the book for painters, contains relevant information for sculptors. The natural assumption we all make before we read either book is that De Pictura is for painters, De Statua is for sculptors, and a sculptor need not read De Pictura. But the fact is, there is a lot of information in De Pictura that is relevant to sculptors, and meant to be read and understood by sculptors as well as painters. Those sculptors that do venture to read De Pictura will have to sift through the work in order to glean the relevant info for sculptors, but it is there. I'll point out just a few choice bits here, but there are many others which I'm not going to go into here, although I do give a fuller list of relevant subjects in my translation of De Statua, or I suggest reading De Pictura yourself. Now, in a nutshell, large sections of these 3 books which make up De Pictura they address subjects solely concerning painters, themes and compositions, color, all that sort of stuff. What concerns the sculptor in this work falls into 2 categories. Basically, you've got the mathematics of Book 1, which speak of the geometric relationship between the model, the work of art, and the observer or creator of that work. In other words, perspective. Now, parts of Book 2 and much of Book 3 actually speak of the studio practice which utilizes this geometric relationship, as well as other general habits and practices of artists, everything from using mirrors or the value of getting regular critiques from other artists. It's all mentioned by Alberti, as well as perspective. So what do the techniques of perspective have to do with sculpture? I mean, apart from relief sculpture, perspective and its methods wouldn't seem to apply to sculpture in the round, right? Sculpture in the round, it doesn't contain foreshortening. There's no need for a vanishing point, and it'd be impossible to put it in a sculpture in the round. And therefore, there is no illusion of distance into which a fully 3-dimensional sculpture recedes, right? Perspective gives the illusion of depth. In sculpture in the round, that depth is real. Well, the relevance of perspective for sculptors can be understood only when we realize that the phenomenon of perspective is actually divided into 2 separate actions on the part of the artist. There is the act of perception and the act of rendering. All right? Now, it's only the rendering of perspective that solely concerns painters and not sculptors. The technique of rendering perspective is, one we're all familiar with. First you draw your horizon line, then you mark a point as your vanishing point, and so on and so on. But what's actually going on here? Well, when you render perspective on a 2-dimensional canvas or piece of paper, you are creating the illusion of a relationship between a scene and the viewer of that scene. On the canvas, a theoretical visual impression is created using geometry of optics relative to a point of view, the literal observational viewpoint of a person standing in front of that canvas. When an object is drawn in perspective, it's not an accurate drawing of the object itself. It is an accurate drawing of a viewer's perception of that object. Rendering perspective is rendering a point of view. Have you ever seen works by the artist M.C. Escher? I'm thinking of the ones which contain buildings built with impossible architecture, stairways that will just lead up and up, turning several corners, only to arrive back at the bottom of the stairs. Optical illusions rendered in this way, play on the idea of the observational viewpoint. What Escher did was to draw objects in perspective, but from two or more simultaneous viewpoints. And this is why his architectural rendering seems impossible, because it would be impossible to view the world from two locations at the same time with the same set of eyes. We cannot have two simultaneous visual relationships to the world around us and have it make sense. But a rendering of such relationship can be constructed. Rendering perspective can be done on a completely theoretical level. We only need the geometry. We don't need to observe it in nature. And we can use it to create a convincing pictorial space with absolutely no reliance on observation of such a space. And when we bend those rules of optics in doing so, we can create an optical illusion. So all that is about the rendering of perspective. Now, I mentioned a second aspect of perspective, and that of the perception of perspective. Perception of perspective is the phenomenon of observing that visual relationship with the world which the rendering of perspective imitates. So observation of an object is the real experience of a real relationship a viewer has with the world, and the rendering of perspective is an imitation of that relationship and experience. So two different things. However, these two different things are governed by the same laws of geometry. And just as we can use these laws to create an imitation of a scene in perspective, we can use these laws to measure and compare the rendering to the observation, effectively using our eyes as finely tuned measuring devices operating according to optical principles. Applying the geometric rules of optical perspective to modeling technique is an enormous asset for sculptors who wish to represent anything from nature. So how is this done? How do we use our eyes as an accurate and objective measuring tool? Well, we actually do it all the time in our daily life. All the time. Let's say, for example, you have a handful of nails, and you want to find 3 nails of equal length. Well, one way to do it would be to use a ruler and measure each nail one by one, right? But a much faster way, and a way which does not require a measuring tool other than your eye, would be to start placing the nails side by side, parallel to each other on a table. And we can instantly see which are the same size or shorter or longer. We can do so because of the relationship of our eyes to the nails. We can draw imaginary lines from the tops and the bottoms of the nail heads, and if these imaginary lines between 2 nails seem parallel, well, then the nails are probably of equal length. But as you place the nails into a row, and you notice that the farther apart any 2 nails are, the more difficult it is to determine subtle differences between the lengths of the nails, right? As the row of nails grows wider and wider, the distance from your eye to a nail at the end of the row might be greater than the distance from your eye to a nail at the center of the row. Now you perceive objects which are distant to be smaller than when they are close. So comparing the length of a close object to the length of a distant object is more difficult to do than when the objects are at the same distance from your eye or next to each other. Now, if you sculpt from live models, you may well already utilize aspects of this principle, right? So if you're sculpting a portrait bust from life at full scale, you probably have found that the easiest way to judge and compare the clay model to the living model is to place the clay bust next to the model and then stand back to compare. Just like the row of nails, you can draw imaginary horizontal lines from the top of the head or the bottom of the chin, or you could even use a string held at arm's length and create a real horizontal line in your field of vision. And then you can use that line to compare the elevations of the tops of heads, of the height of the chins, of the tip of the noses. Any aspect of the sculpture in which you can compare elevation becomes a no-brainer. And as Alberti says, all knowledge of large and small, long and short, high, low, broad, narrow, clear, dark, light and shadow, and every similar attribute is obtained by comparison. Thus all things are known by comparison. For comparison contains within itself a power which immediately demonstrates in objects which is more, less, or equal. And that's just the beginning. Now let's say you wanted to sculpt a figure at some fraction of the scale of the model. Now you could take lots of measurements with rules and compasses and do the math and proceed to work from a list of numbers to determine your proper scale. Or, you could do what Alberti suggests and build 2 rulers, one full scale and one small scale. Or you could use optical geometry to do the same thing, minus all the math, and minus building rulers. Here's how you could do it. Let's say you wanted to make a figure exactly half scale to the model. So you put your live model all the way at one end of the room, right? And then you put your clay tripod, what you're going to build your model on, you put that, say, 8 feet in front of the model. And then you yourself would stand back another 8 feet. So 16 feet from the live model and 8 feet from the clay model. And from a very particular, a precise point of observation, your live model will be twice as far away from you as the clay, which means your clay figure, if it were exactly half the scale of the model, would then appear exactly the same size as the model. But again, only from that one particular point of view. Nowadays, this optical geometric technique is called sight size. Now, it's mostly known as a painter's technique and one that will be familiar to anyone who's done a cast drawing as part of one's training, but it applies equally in three-dimensional work. Now back to Alberti and his theories. What does Alberti have to say about comparison and viewpoints? He says this: "Know that a painted thing can never appear truthful where there is not a definite distance for seeing it. I will give the reason for this, if I ever write of my demonstrations, which were called miracles by my friends when they saw and marveled at them." So one has to wonder exactly what Alberti refers to as his miraculous demonstrations. We don't know anything more about them than what Alberti says here. But much more interesting to me is Alberti's assertion which his demonstrations would have sought to prove, and that is that a painted thing can never appear truthful where there is not a definite distance for seeing it. Now, that definite distance, Alberti mentions, is nothing more than that fixed point of observation needed for observing and then rendering perspective, where the painted thing appears truthful, to use Alberti's phrase. Now, this concept of a definite distance, of a fixed and immobile viewpoint, it makes perfect sense, of course. I mean, when you're painting a picture, you don't shift your point of view halfway through, right? You stay in the same place to get the same point of view. A change in position creates a new relation between observer and object. And these laws of optics, which require a single viewpoint, apply equally, whether the subject is being observed for a painting or for a sculpture. In either case, the most accurate means of visual comparison is to place your live model and your work relative to each other and relative to a single point of observation. The only real difference between observing while painting versus observing while sculpting is that sculptors must periodically rotate their work as well as their model for additional angles. So as long as the visual relationship between the model, the clay work, and the viewpoint remain constant from angle to angle, the technique will work. Now, having said all that, we can only infer exactly how Alberti imagined optical perspective to apply to sculpture. He didn't detail a technique like he did for painting in perspective, but at least we sculptors can infer and develop a visual technique from his theories. A final thought about using the eyes as a tool to measure the world around us. For all its power, observation, visual observation, is ultimately a subjective means of information. The pure geometry of optics our eye takes in, it gets filtered through our consciousness with all its assumptions, prejudices, desires, and bias. Each of us really does look at the world through a different set of eyes. But when we sculptors strive to give our best and most honest attempt to reproduce our visual perception, the degree by which we fall short of objectivity might just be the hallmark of our true expression and our own unique vision. All right, thanks again for listening. Hey, now that The Sculptor's Funeral is on iTunes and Stitcher mobile app, I hope that if you listen each week, that you have actually subscribed to the podcast, because doing so ensures that your vote for this podcast gets counted, and that's going to translate into support for The Sculptor's Funeral. And if you want to do even more, please consider reviewing the podcast and rating it in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you hear it. if enough people give it a good rating, it becomes more visible in the search rankings, which means more listeners. It costs you nothing, takes but a second, and it's helping me out a bunch. Thanks a lot. And I'll be back next week.